So if I ask you whether you think it's ever okay to boil a human baby to death, most of you would say, no, absolutely, it's always wrong. And what that shows is that there is a little bit of Kantianism in you. Okay, whether you want to admit it or not, there's some Kantianism in you. Or you might, let's say you're trying to steal something, and there's several voices within you, several emotions and desires that are conflicting and so on, but one of the voices says, it's just wrong, period. That's Kantianism. Okay, so there probably is Kantianism within your morality, and arguably it's the foundation of your morality. It's the ground of it. So the first point as we get into Kantianism is it's a type of deontological ethics. There's other types, and it's often contrasted with utilitarianism. So in Kantianism, we're going to emphasize the motive and the act. Utilitarians emphasize the consequences. For the Kantian, you should never misuse people, even if it brings about good consequences. But for the utilitarian, maybe it's okay in some cases if it maximizes the consequences. For the utilitarian, like John Stuart Mill, he says that rights are just nonsense on stilts. Intrinsically, rights aren't intrinsically valuable. But for Kant, rights are very important. Okay? In other words, you should not violate a person's rights. There's a moral obligation to do that, even if it brings about good consequences. So hopefully that gives you a sort of a feel for the difference. Again, a Kantian recognizes the importance of keeping promises, treating people as they deserve to be treated, and following one's duty, all for their own sake, not just because they bring about good consequences. All right, that's what a Kantian would say. So look at the chart to compare and contrast them a bit more. And I'm going to go ahead and get into his moral theory. And a good book that I'm going to start with is The Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. So as a preparatory remark, note that Immanuel Kant is not claiming to discover or create a new morality. Rather, he's describing the common morality that we already share. So all of you said you were against slavery, you think child abuse is wrong, torturing kittens for fun is wrong. Okay, so we seem to share certain moral beliefs, and Kant, like Newton, is going to discover the hidden principles that govern our moral beliefs. And by the way, Kant has several arguments for why these hidden principles are a priori. Which means these principles aren't based on looking at how people behave, but we know how they ought to behave a priori, in a sense. You don't have to get into that, though. So Kant is writing for the person who thinks, that it's wrong to lie in most cases and kill unnecessarily or easily break promises. He's not really writing for the sociopath, psychopath, or for the person who's looking for a reason to be moral. He'll explore that later, but in the beginning, he's just uncovering the hidden principles of morality. So his first point in this book is that the only thing good without qualification is a good will, a good motive. And this is crucial for understanding Kant. Utilitarians think happiness is the sole intrinsic good, but they're wrong because happiness can be good or bad. So for example, if I cheated my way to the top and I'm now very happy, you might say my happiness is bad, right? Or if I find pleasure in torturing kittens, you might say, oh, that's a morally bad pleasure. Or if somebody has courage in killing people, and they show great courage in doing that, you might say, yeah, courage, mental abilities, all of these can be used for good or ill, so they're not good without qualification. But according to Kant, a good will is the only thing good without qualification. And to kind of clarify this, he gives us the examples of two soldiers, and that's why you see the little purple heart up there. Both soldiers are going to attempt to save these 20 people. In the line of fire, right? And both are heroic. But the first soldier gets shot and killed. The second soldier tries it and succeeds. He saves the 20 people. Now, even though the consequences were different, you probably think of both soldiers as morally praiseworthy, as heroes. And that's the point. We call both heroes and we hold them in the same moral regard, even though one succeeded and one failed. And this should make it clear that morality is about good motives, not about good consequences, mostly about good motives. The proper objects of moral judgments are motives, not the consequences that lie beyond our control. Right? So the only unconditional good is a good will. So for some reason, Kant's going to have to, or Kant believes, and he'll explain later, that the good motives, good wills, are under our control, whereas the other things aren't. Okay, and that's going to be important. Okay. To clarify this even further, look at these three shopkeepers. We went over them in class. So the first shopkeeper treats customers fairly because it's in her self-interest, right? Imagine a young ignorant customer walks into the door, but all three shopkeepers refrain from cheating the customer even though they could. Now, the difference is they do it from different motives. So the first shopkeeper acts out of prudence. So she reasons that if she treated the customers poorly, word might spread and she would lose business, so it's in her self-interest to treat everybody fairly. Okay. The second shopkeeper acts from emotion of love and empathy and so on, and she treats the customer well because she has inclinations and love and so on for the customer. Now the third shopkeeper treats the customer well because it's her duty. This third shopkeeper, you can imagine, maybe doesn't feel empathy and love and doesn't care about self-interest, or maybe she does, I don't know, but she's acting from duty, right? Not from her feelings. So they're all performing the same action, but they differ in their motives. So what's the most moral who's the most moral here of these three shopkeepers? And most of my students say shopkeeper 2, right? Shopkeeper 2 has this this wonderful emotional set where she actually cares for people. But according to Kant, only shopkeeper 3 is acting morally. And that's going to take a lot of explaining, but the basic reason is only shopkeeper 3 is acting from duty. The others are acting from inclination or self-interest. And notice that freedom and autonomy is really central to this concept of what it means to act from duty and to be moral. So we don't hold 2-year-olds morally responsible because we don't believe they have free will. Also, if I fall off a building and kill somebody, you probably won't hold me morally responsible, or not as morally responsible as if I went out and premeditatedly got a gun and killed somebody, right? And that's because you believe in the first case I didn't act with free will, in the second case I did. So you hold me morally responsible based on whether or not you think I had free will, despite modern objections. So this second shopkeeper is acting from feelings and emotions, but what happens when she feels bad the next day? Today she feels empathy, tomorrow she might feel like knocking your head off. So the point is that she doesn't have free will over her emotions and feelings, but morality is based on free will, so morality can't be based on these feelings and emotions. Now I'm jumping the gun a bit early, but the main point is that according to Kant, only the third shopkeeper is acting from duty and therefore moral. All three are in accord with duty, but only the third is from. Now there's a common misunderstanding that arises at this point, and some people think that Immanuel Kant is prizing the person who has very base desires. They just hate the customers, and yet they treat them fairly out of duty. Right? So it seems like Kant is saying that if you hate the customers and you treat them fairly, then you're morally better than the merchant who loves the customers and treats them well, but also acts out of duty. And Kant is not saying that. Kant says elsewhere that it's good and proper to have love and good inclinations like the second shopkeeper does. Indeed, he believes we have a duty to cultivate such emotions in ourselves. But his point is that the moral worth of the act lies in acting from duty. Acting from duty, right? That's where the freedom is. That's the moral worth and so on. Now, in my personal opinion, I agree with Kant, but I also like virtue theory as a supplement to Kant. So the ideal shopkeeper in my mind is a blend of 2 and 3, shopkeepers 2 and 3. Someone who acts from duty, but this person is also integrated their life so that their desires and emotions are in accord with their duty. And everything's harmonized, like in Plato's Soul. So that's an interesting side note. Okay, so let's see where we're at. So far, the only thing good is acting from a good will. And goodwill means acting from duty, right? Not just in accord with it. And acting from duty is acting because we somehow know what we ought to do. But what is this ought? What is this duty? What constitutes duty? So at this point, Kant is going to explain that. He's going to explain the 2 types of oughts that we experiences, and he calls these oughts imperatives. Imperatives are commands. They're oughts that we experience. The first type is called the hypothetical imperative, and there's actually 2 types of hypotheticals we don't need to get into. And the second type is the categorical imperative, and the categorical imperative is the source of morality. So the hypothetical imperatives are based on my goals and desires. They're based on what I want. So if I want to be a ballerina, then I ought to practice ballet. But if I don't want to be a ballerina, then that hypothetical imperative, that I ought to practice ballet, doesn't arise. If I want to be a merman, then I ought to practice swimming, right? And so on. So I experience hypothetical imperatives when I have certain desires, and you might experience different imperatives because you have different desires. But categorical imperatives are different because they're always there. They're there regardless of my goals and desires. They're not based on what I want. They flow from my nature that I can't escape, my rational nature. So, and all these categorical imperatives are always there. They're like the beating of my heart. They're always there whether I know it or not, whether I pay attention to it or not. They tell me things like I ought not to steal, even though my strongest desire may be to steal. And they tell me I ought not to break promises, even though it may be in my self-interest, I think. Or I ought not to merely use people as tools, even though that would be great. Okay. I ought not to boil babies to death, and so on. So all of these categorical imperatives constitute morality for Kant, and he's going to have to explain more of what they are and where they come from. So in these slides here, what you see is some comparisons between the hypothetical and categorical imperatives. You might want to pause them. And then you see an activity where we distinguish between the two. And of those four statements, only the third one is categorical, because it says you should not lie because lying is wrong, period. The first one's hypothetical, because if you're just seeking a reward in the afterlife, you haven't even entered the moral sphere, according to Kant. You're just, because of what you want, your changing desires is what that is based on, that ought. Or number two, you should be honest, because if you aren't, you might get in a difficult situation and embarrassed and stuff. Again, that's not morality. That's based on a fear of embarrassment and so on. Number four, you should not lie because God says so. That's not a categorical imperative. For Kant, morality is not based on belief in God. Even though Kant believes in God, he doesn't believe morality is based on belief in God. He does, in a deep sense, believe that morality supports a sort of faith in God, but that's different. But yeah, you don't need to believe in God to be moral, according to Kant. So anyway, that's the hypothetical and categorical imperatives, and now we want to look more closely at the categorical. Again, you might be a bit confused at this point and say, well, don't our duties, our oughts, our categorical oughts come from our culture? And again, Kant would say no. It's the categorical ought is the ought that tells you which cultural beliefs are right and which ones are wrong. You might say, isn't this just my conscience? And perhaps it is, but Kant here is investigating exactly what conscience is, and he's saying it's the categorical imperative, in a deep sense, right? So yeah, so let's look at the categorical imperative then. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, the first formulation. Let me make sure I got the slide up here. Okay, so he's going to give us different formulations. He says there's 3, and he gives us 5, I believe. And the first formulation is to act on that maxim that you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So his idea here is, let's see here, to whatever you're about to do, ask yourself, what if everybody were doing it at all times and all places? Okay, and this would be the maxim, the rule you would be following. Now, when you say that, if it leads to a logical contradiction, then it's not permissible in a moral sense. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is just stop and pick up in the next video to explain the rest of this. Thanks.